The candle in Eleanor Whitmore's hand shook as she read the letter a second time, because the words did not change no matter how many times her eyes moved across the page. Her father owed more money than the family had seen in 10 years, and the man who held the debt wanted payment within the month or he would take the house. She folded the letter and pressed it flat against her chest, as if she could keep the news from spreading further than her own heart. Downstairs, she could hear her mother laughing with Charlotte about ribbons and slippers for the county ball, unaware that the floor beneath their feet was about to be sold. Eleanor did not go down right away. She sat at the small writing desk in her room, the one with the wobbling leg that nobody had bothered to fix, and she began doing what she always did when trouble came. She counted. She counted the coins in the tin box under her bed, the unpaid bills in the drawer, the months until her father's small pension would arrive again. She was 17 the first time she had done this kind of counting, and she was 2 years past 20 now, and still no one in her family thought to ask her opinion on money, even though she was the only one who understood it. Her sister Charlotte was different. Charlotte was the kind of beautiful that made rooms go quiet when she entered them. Golden hair, a laugh like a bell, and a way of tilting her head that made men forget what they were saying. Their mother, Mrs. Whitmore, had built her whole hope for the family's future around Charlotte's face, certain that beauty alone could fix what money could not. Tonight was the county ball, and it was said that the new Duke of Ashford would attend, a man who had inherited his title only months ago, and who every unmarried woman in 3 counties had already decided to marry in her mind. Eleanor did not care about dukes. She cared about the number in the tin box, and the number was not large enough. She went downstairs eventually, dressed in a gown that had already been re-sewn twice, and stood quietly while her mother fussed over Charlotte's hair in front of the hallway mirror. Her father, Lord Whitmore, sat in his chair by the window, coughing into a handkerchief, his face pale in a way that worried Eleanor more than the debt did. He caught her eye and gave her a small, tired smile, the kind that asked for patience without saying so, and Eleanor smiled back because that was the only thing she knew how to give him. The carriage ride to the ball was full of Charlotte's chatter and their mother's instructions. Stand near the punch table where the light is good. Laugh softly, never loudly. If the Duke asks you to dance, do not appear too eager, but do not appear cold either. Eleanor listened to all of it with her eyes on the window, watching the hedgerows blur past in the dark, thinking instead about how many more months the roof could hold before it needed repair, and whether that cost more or less than the debt itself. The ballroom, when they arrived, was bright and loud and smelled of candle wax and perfume. Eleanor found her usual place near the wall, close enough to be present, far enough to be forgotten, which suited her fine. She watched Charlotte glide into the center of the room like a queen arriving at her own coronation, watched the young men turn their heads, watched her mother's face glow with satisfaction. This was the performance her family had rehearsed for years, and Eleanor had long ago accepted her part in it, which was simply to stand aside and let it happen. She slipped out to the garden not long after, unable to bear the heat of so many bodies pressed into one room. The night air was cool and sharp, and the stars were unusually clear, and for a moment she allowed herself to forget the letter upstairs in her room and the debt collector's cold handwriting. She walked along the stone path until she reached the small fountain at the far end of the garden, where the music from inside faded into a soft hum. She was not alone for long. A man stood near the fountain already, his back to her, his coat dark and well cut, his posture the kind that came from a lifetime of being watched and judged. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and in the moonlight she saw a face that was handsome in a serious way, not soft like the young men inside who smiled too easily. He looked, she thought, like someone who had also come outside to escape something. "Forgive me," she said. "I did not know anyone else had found this place." "Nor did I expect company," he answered. His voice was low and careful. "I find ballrooms exhausting. Too many people wanting too many things from a man they have only just met." Eleanor almost laughed, surprised by how closely his words matched her own thoughts. "I understand that feeling well, though for different reasons. In my case, no one wants anything from me at all. I find that its own kind of exhausting." He studied her for a moment, and she felt suddenly self-conscious about her plain gown and her plain hair, certain he would soon excuse himself and return to whatever more important conversation awaited him inside. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, curious. "That seems like a strange complaint to make at a ball," he said. "Most people would envy being left alone. Perhaps. But there is a difference between choosing to be alone and being placed there by everyone else's expectations." She surprised herself with how easily the words came out, how honest she was being with a stranger she would likely never speak to again. "My sister is inside. She is very beautiful. I am not saying this to be unkind to her, only stating a fact the whole county has already agreed upon. Wherever she stands, people gather. Wherever I stand, they walk past. I stopped minding it years ago. You say that as though it were true, he said, but I do not think it fully is. She looked at him properly then, this stranger who spoke to her as though her feelings were worth considering, and something in his gaze made her feel, for the first time that evening, that she was not invisible after all. She did not know his name, and strangely, she did not ask. There was something freeing about a conversation with no expectations attached to it, no family fortune riding on the outcome, no mother listening from 3 feet away. They spoke for perhaps 20 minutes, about small things. He asked what she thought of the harvest that year, and she gave him an honest answer about the price of grain and how it would affect families like hers before winter came. He seemed genuinely interested, asking follow-up questions instead of simply nodding politely the way most men did when a woman spoke of anything beyond fashion. She asked him nothing about himself, and he offered little, only that he had recently taken on responsibilities he had not expected to carry so soon, and that he found the weight of them heavier than he had imagined. You speak like someone who has had to grow up faster than he wished to, Eleanor said. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite name. That is a very perceptive thing to say to a man whose name you do not even know. Would knowing your name change what I said? No, he admitted. I do not believe it would. A bell rang faintly from inside, signaling that the next dance was about to begin, and Eleanor knew she should return before her mother noticed her absence and asked uncomfortable questions. She curtsied politely to the stranger, who bowed in return, and she turned to walk back toward the light and noise of the ballroom, already certain that whatever pleasant moment this had been, it would not be repeated. She was wrong. Inside, the crowd had gathered near the entrance of the ballroom, whispering excitedly, and Eleanor pushed gently through the edge of the group to see what had caused the stir. A footman stood near the doorway, announcing in a clear voice that had suddenly gone quiet enough for everyone to hear, that His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, had arrived, and was already among the guests. Eleanor's stomach dropped as understanding settled over her slowly, like cold water finding every gap in a coat. She turned instinctively toward the garden doors, but the man from the fountain was no longer behind her. Instead, she saw him now standing near the center of the room, greeting Charlotte with a polite, practiced bow, his expression unreadable, while her mother beamed with a pride so intense it seemed to light the whole room brighter than the candles did. He was the Duke. She had spoken to him for 20 minutes without knowing it, had told him honestly what she thought of her own family's expectations, had complained, in a sense, about the very shadow that her sister cast over her, without knowing she was speaking to the one man whose attention the entire county desperately wanted to win. Her cheeks burned with a mixture of embarrassment and something else she could not fully name, something that felt dangerously close to hope, though she pushed that feeling down immediately, certain it was foolish. She watched from the edge of the room as the Duke was introduced formally to Charlotte, watched her sister perform the same charming laugh she used on every man of consequence, watched her mother hover nearby like a general overseeing a battle she was certain to win. The Duke's expression remained polite throughout, correct in every way a gentleman should be, and yet Eleanor noticed something she doubted anyone else in the room would think to look for. His eyes moved once, briefly, toward the edge of the crowd, toward her, before returning to Charlotte's conversation as though nothing had happened at all. It was such a small thing, a glance that lasted less than a second. Eleanor told herself it meant nothing, that she was imagining significance where there was none, that a man in his position surely looked at many things in a crowded room without any of them mattering. She turned away before he could catch her watching him, and busied herself pretending interest in a tray of refreshments she did not want. Her mother found her 20 minutes later, practically glowing. "Eleanor, did you see him?" The Duke himself spoke to Charlotte for nearly 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Mrs. Sinclair says he has not spoken that long to any young lady all season. Her mother's hands fluttered as she spoke, arranging invisible details in the air. This could be it. This could truly be it. Eleanor nodded and said the correct, expected things, congratulations disguised as encouragement, though her mind kept drifting back to the fountain, to the low, careful voice asking her opinion on grain prices, to the way he had said that is a very perceptive thing to say, as though her words carried real weight. She told herself firmly that it did not matter. He was a duke, and dukes married beautiful, celebrated women like Charlotte, not overlooked younger sisters who managed household ledgers and counted coins in tin boxes under their beds. Later that night, as the carriage carried them home and Charlotte talked endlessly about every word the Duke had said to her, repeating his sentences as though they were sacred scripture, Eleanor stared out the window at the dark countryside passing by. Her father's debt was still unpaid, the house was still at risk. Nothing about her situation had changed in any real practical way. And yet, as she closed her eyes that night, it was not the letter from the debt collector that occupied her thoughts. It was a low voice near a fountain, asking her honest questions and listening to her honest answers, as though she were the only person in the garden worth speaking to at all. She fell asleep telling herself firmly that it meant nothing, and woke the next morning already wondering if she would see him again. She did not have to wonder long. 3 days later, a letter arrived at Whitmore House addressed to Lord Whitmore, requesting permission for the Duke of Ashford to call upon the family the following week. Charlotte screamed with joy, loud enough to bring the housekeeper running. Their mother wept happy tears into her handkerchief. Their father, still pale from his illness, managed a genuine smile for the first time in weeks, already imagining how a connection to a dukedom might soften the blow of his debts. Eleanor read the letter herself, later, when no one was watching, and noticed something the others had not. The letter did not mention Charlotte by name at all. It simply requested permission to call upon the Whitmore family, in general terms, without specifying which daughter he wished to see. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself it meant nothing at all. But she kept the small detail folded quietly in her mind, the way she kept every number in her ledgers, waiting to see what it would eventually add up to. The morning the Duke was expected to call, Whitmore House moved like a hive under threat. Mrs. Whitmore had the parlor rearranged twice, first to show off the good chairs and then to hide the worn patch in the carpet beneath a small table nobody ever used. Charlotte spent nearly 3 hours on her hair alone, and by the time she came downstairs in her pale blue gown, she looked, Eleanor had to admit, like something out of a painting. Eleanor herself had been told plainly by her mother to remain upstairs during the visit, to check on their father and keep him company, since there was no reason for her to be present while the Duke called on Charlotte. Eleanor did not argue. She had learned long ago that arguing with her mother over matters concerning Charlotte's prospects was like arguing with weather. It simply happened around you regardless of what you said. She went up to her father's room instead, carrying a tray of tea and toast, and found him sitting by the window with a book open on his lap that he was not reading. "You look tired, Papa," she said, setting the tray down. "I am tired of pretending my chest does not hurt when I breathe," he said, with the dry humor that was so unlike her mother's constant worry. "But do not tell your mother I said so. She has enough to manage today without adding me to the list." Eleanor poured his tea and sat beside him, and for a while they simply listened to the sounds drifting up from below, the distant scrape of a carriage on gravel, the murmur of voices in the front hall. Her father reached over at one point and patted her hand. "You have been carrying too much of this family's worry for a girl your age," he said quietly. "The debts, the accounts, all of it. I know you think I do not notice, but I do. I am sorry for it. Someone has to notice the numbers, Papa. It might as well be me." "It should not have to be anyone but me," he said, and there was real regret in his voice. "When I am better, I will take it back up properly. I promise you that." Eleanor did not answer, because she did not believe he would ever be well enough to take up anything properly again, though she loved him too much to say so aloud. Downstairs, the visit was not going the way Mrs. Whitmore had planned. The Duke arrived precisely on time, dressed simply but well, and was shown into the parlor where Charlotte sat perfectly composed on the good chair, her mother hovering nearby like a hopeful shadow. The conversation began pleasantly enough. Charlotte spoke of the ball, of the music, of a new bonnet she had seen in town, and the Duke answered politely, correctly, with the careful courtesy of a man performing a duty, rather than enjoying a pleasure. After perhaps half an hour, during a lull in Charlotte's chatter, the Duke turned to Mrs. Whitmore and asked, in a tone so casual it barely registered as unusual, whether the whole family might be at home, as he understood there was another daughter as well. Mrs. Whitmore's smile flickered for just a moment before she recovered it. "Eleanor, yes, my younger daughter. She is upstairs attending to her father, who is unwell. I am sure she would not wish to interrupt your visit." "Not at all," the Duke said. "I would not want to trouble anyone. I only recalled meeting a young lady in the garden during the ball, and wondered if it might have been her." Charlotte's smile stiffened almost imperceptibly, though she recovered quickly, laughing lightly and saying that Eleanor did prefer quiet corners to crowded rooms, always had, ever since they were girls. She said it kindly enough on the surface, but Eleanor, had she been present to hear it, would have recognized the small blade hidden inside the compliment. The Duke did not press the matter further, though something in his expression suggested he had noted the deflection carefully. filing it away the way a careful man files away every small detail that does not quite match what he is being told. It was nearly an hour later, as the visit was ending and the Duke was being shown to the door, that Eleanor came down the stairs to fetch more tea for her father, and nearly collided with him in the front hall. Both of them stopped, surprised, and for a moment neither spoke. "Miss Whitmore," the Duke said, and something in the way he said it, warmer than mere politeness required, made Eleanor's chest tighten unexpectedly. "Your Grace," she answered, dropping into a proper curtsy, though her cheeks had already begun to warm. "I apologize, I did not know you were still here. I was just leaving. I am glad, however, for the chance to correct an oversight. I did not know, when we spoke at the fountain, that I was speaking with Miss Eleanor Whitmore. I am glad to know it now." Mrs. Whitmore appeared behind him then, her face carefully arranged into pleasantness, though her eyes carried a warning that Eleanor recognized instantly. "Eleanor, dear, do not keep his Grace from his carriage. I am sure he has a busy afternoon ahead." "Of course," Eleanor said quickly, stepping aside. The Duke bowed, his eyes lingering on hers for just a moment longer than courtesy required, and then he was gone, out the door and into his waiting carriage, leaving behind a hallway that suddenly felt too quiet. Her mother's hand found her arm the moment the door closed, gripping it with a strength that surprised Eleanor. "What was that?" she said, her voice low and sharp in a way it rarely was. "What happened at that fountain, Eleanor?" "Nothing happened, Mama. We spoke for a few minutes. I did not know who he was." "You did not know, or you did not think to ask, because you knew perfectly well that if you had, you would have had the sense to walk away and leave the garden to your sister." Her mother's grip tightened further. "This family cannot afford confusion right now, Eleanor. Your father's health, the debts, everything depends on Charlotte making a good match. And a good match means the Duke, and the Duke means Charlotte, not you. Do you understand me?" Eleanor pulled her arm gently free, hurt blooming somewhere beneath her ribs, though she kept her face carefully still. "I understand you perfectly, Mama. I always have." She went back upstairs without another word, though the conversation stayed with her the rest of the day, replaying itself in small, painful fragments while she sat with her father and pretended everything was fine. The Duke returned twice more over the following 2 weeks, each visit following a similar pattern. He would sit with Charlotte and Mrs. Whitmore in the parlor, polite and correct, and each time, before he left, he would find some small reason to speak with Eleanor as well. A question about a book he had seen on a shelf, a comment about the garden, a moment in the hallway that seemed to happen by accident but never quite felt accidental. Mrs. Whitmore began arranging things carefully to prevent these moments, keeping Eleanor occupied elsewhere during his visits, but the Duke, it seemed, had a talent for finding her regardless. During the third visit, Eleanor was in the small garden behind the house, cutting herbs for the kitchen, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path, and turned to find the Duke standing there, having apparently slipped away from the parlor under some excuse. "You should not be here," she said, glancing nervously toward the house. "My mother will notice you are missing." "Your mother notices a great many things," he said, "but I find myself less concerned with her notice than I probably should be." He looked around the small garden, at the neat rows of herbs, the careful pruning of the roses along the fence. "Did you plan this garden yourself?" "I did. My mother thinks it a waste of my time. She would prefer I spend my hours on things more likely to attract a husband. And yet I find it far more interesting than any conversation I have had in a ballroom this season." He crouched slightly to examine a row of lavender, and Eleanor found herself studying his profile, the seriousness of it, the way his expression softened only slightly when he thought no one was paying close attention. "I meant to ask you, at the ball, when you spoke of the harvest and the price of grain, where did you learn such things? Most young ladies of your station are not taught to think of such matters." "I taught myself, out of necessity. My father has been unwell for some time, and someone had to manage the household accounts. I found I had a talent for it, or perhaps simply no other choice." She did not know why she was being so honest with him, only that something about his steady attention made honesty feel safer than performance. "I do not tell most people this. It is not considered an attractive quality in a wife." "I would say the opposite," he said, straightening to look at her directly. "I have spent the past several months since inheriting my title, surrounded by people who tell me what they think I wish to hear. It is exhausting, Miss Whitmore, in a way I cannot fully explain to someone who has not experienced it. You are the first person in a long while who has spoken to me as though I were simply a man, rather than a title attached to a fortune." Eleanor felt her face warm again, and she busied her hands with the herbs to avoid meeting his eyes too directly. "You should return to the parlor, Your Grace. My sister will wonder where you have gone." "Your sister is lovely," he said, and there was no unkindness in it, only simple honesty. But loveliness alone has never held my attention for very long. I find I am drawn instead to people who do not perform for me, who speak plainly even when plain speech is inconvenient. He paused, watching her carefully. You have never once, in any of our conversations, tried to flatter me or tell me what you think I wish to hear. I find that rarer than you might imagine. He left shortly after, slipping back toward the parlor before his absence became too noticeable, but Eleanor remained in the garden a while longer, her heart beating faster than the moment seemed to warrant, turning his words over carefully in her mind the way she turned over numbers in her ledgers, searching for what they truly added up to. That evening, Charlotte came to Eleanor's room, her expression tight in a way that was unusual for her. You have been speaking with him, Charlotte said, without preamble, alone, in the garden. He wandered out while I was cutting herbs. I did not seek him out, Charlotte. That is not what Mama believes, and it is certainly not what it looks like. Charlotte sat on the edge of Eleanor's bed, her arms crossed, her usual warmth replaced by something colder. Do you have any idea what this match means for this family? For Papa? For all of us? And you are out in the garden charming him with talk of grain prices, of all things. I am not trying to charm anyone, Charlotte. I am simply being myself. Well, perhaps that is the problem, Charlotte said, and immediately looked as though she regretted the sharpness of it, though she did not take it back. She stood and walked to the door, pausing there with her hand on the frame. I am not trying to be cruel, Eleanor. I am frightened. If this match fails, I do not know what becomes of us. Please, just be more careful, for all our sakes. She left before Eleanor could answer, and Eleanor sat alone in the quiet of her room for a long while afterward, caught between the guilt of her sister's fear and the strange, stubborn warmth that still lingered from the garden, the memory of the Duke saying she had never once tried to flatter him, as though that alone made her worth noticing. She did not know, not yet, how much harder the coming weeks would make it to remain careful at all. Lady Beatrice Sinclair arrived at Whitmore House 3 days later, uninvited but never unwelcome, since her family's connections made her presence useful to Mrs. Whitmore in ways that went beyond friendship. She swept into the parlor in a gown of deep green, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the room before she even sat down, and within minutes she had steered the conversation toward the one subject everyone in the county seemed unable to stop discussing. They say he has called 3 times now, Beatrice said, accepting a cup of tea from Charlotte with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. That is more than he has called on any other family this season. You must be very close to securing him, Charlotte. I would like to think so, Charlotte said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Beatrice's gaze slid, almost carelessly, toward the doorway where Eleanor had just entered carrying a fresh pot of tea. And yet I heard something curious from Mrs. Pratt, who heard it from her housemaid, who heard it from a footman at the Ashford estate. They say the Duke has asked after Eleanor specifically, more than once. Is that true? The room went quiet in a way that made Eleanor's hands tighten around the teapot. Mrs. Whitmore's smile grew fixed and brittle. Servants gossip, Lady Beatrice. I would not put much stock in it. Of course not, Beatrice said smoothly, though her eyes did not leave Eleanor's face, studying her with the careful attention of someone assembling a puzzle. Still, it is an interesting rumor, is it not? The quiet sister catching a duke's eye while the beautiful one performs for him, like something out of a novel. Eleanor set the teapot down carefully, refusing to let her hands shake. I assure you, Lady Beatrice, there is nothing between the Duke and myself beyond ordinary courtesy. He has been kind enough to speak with me during his visits, nothing more. Of course, Beatrice said again, though her tone made it clear she believed nothing of the sort. She turned back to Charlotte with renewed sweetness. You must not let such foolish rumors trouble you, dear Charlotte. A duke would never seriously consider a match with a woman who spends her days counting household accounts and cutting herbs, no matter how kind he is in conversation. Men are kind to servants too, after all. The comparison stung more than Eleanor expected, and she excused herself quickly, retreating to the kitchen where she could busy her hands with something useful and let her face settle back into its usual calm. She had known, in some vague way, that word of the Duke's attention would eventually spread beyond her own family, but hearing it spoken aloud so plainly, turned into gossip and comparison, made the whole situation feel suddenly much more dangerous than it had before. The danger became clearer over the following days. Invitations that had once arrived regularly for small teas and afternoon visits among the county's young ladies began to dwindle for Eleanor specifically, while Charlotte's continued as before. When Eleanor did attend a gathering at the Pratt residence later that week, she noticed the conversation growing quieter whenever she approached a group. noticed glances exchanged between women who had once greeted her warmly enough, noticed the particular way Lady Beatrice smiled at her from across the room, like a cat watching something small and cornered. "I heard she set her cap at him deliberately," one young woman whispered to another, not quite quietly enough as Eleanor passed near the refreshment table, pretending to be modest and plain so he would notice the contrast with her sister. Quite clever, really, if it is true. Eleanor did not turn to correct them. She had learned long ago that defending herself against rumors only fed them further, gave them more material to work with, more evidence that she cared enough to fight back. She finished her tea in silence and left the gathering earlier than planned, walking home along the country lane instead of waiting for the family carriage, needing the quiet and the fresh air more than she needed to sit through another hour of whispered judgment. Her father's condition worsened around the same time, a development that pushed the gossip briefly from her mind, replaced by a deeper, more immediate fear. The physician who visited Whitmore House shook his head gravely after examining Lord Whitmore, speaking quietly to Mrs. Whitmore in the hallway, in tones meant to be private but audible enough for Eleanor, listening from the top of the stairs, to catch every word. His heart was weak, the physician said. Rest was essential, and worry above all things must be avoided, though how a man could avoid worry while drowning in debt was a question the physician did not attempt to answer. That evening, Lord Whitmore called Eleanor to his room, his voice weaker than it had been even a week before. "I have made a decision," he said, once she was seated beside his bed. "I intend to speak with your mother about withdrawing you from further contact with the Duke's visits. It is not fair to you, Eleanor, to be caught in the middle of this, the way you have been. The whispers, the comparisons. You deserve better than to be treated as an obstacle in your own sister's courtship. Papa, you do not need to do that. I am managing well enough. You are managing, because you have always managed everything in this family, far more than a daughter your age should have to." He reached for her hand, his grip weaker than she remembered it being even a month before. "I have been a poor steward of this family's fortune, and an even poorer father to notice how much weight you have carried while I sat by and let it happen. Let me do this one thing properly at least." Eleanor did not have the heart to argue with him, though privately she doubted her mother would agree to any arrangement that risked losing the Duke's favor entirely, regardless of which daughter he seemed to prefer. She kissed her father's forehead and left him to rest, carrying the weight of his words down the stairs with her, unsure whether she felt comforted or simply more burdened by his concern. Her mother, predictably, refused the suggestion outright when Lord Whitmore raised it the following morning, insisting that Eleanor's continued presence in the household during the Duke's visits was perfectly natural and could not be avoided without raising further suspicion. What she did instead was more subtle and in some ways more painful. She began assigning Eleanor tasks during each of the Duke's scheduled visits: errands to the village, letters to be delivered, accounts to be reviewed in the study with the door firmly closed, anything that would keep her occupied and absent without appearing deliberately cruel. The Duke noticed, of course. During his fourth visit, he asked Mrs. Whitmore directly, with a politeness that did not fully disguise the firmness beneath it, whether Miss Eleanor might join them, as he had grown accustomed to her presence and found the conversation lacking without it. Mrs. Whitmore's composure cracked only slightly before she recovered it. "Eleanor is occupied with household matters today, Your Grace. She sends her regrets." "Perhaps another time, then," the Duke said, though something in his expression suggested he understood precisely what game was being played, and did not care for it. He found a way regardless. As he was leaving that afternoon, he took a longer route to his carriage, passing by the study window where Eleanor sat bent over the household ledgers, and paused just long enough to catch her eye through the glass. He did not stop, did not draw attention to himself in a way that would alarm anyone watching, but the brief look he gave her carried a warmth that stayed with her long after his carriage had disappeared down the drive. That warmth, however, came at a cost. Lady Beatrice's whispers grew bolder over the following week, spreading now beyond casual gossip into something more deliberate. A rumor began circulating that Eleanor had been seen alone with the Duke on more than one occasion, under circumstances no respectable young woman would allow, a rumor with no truth in it beyond the innocent garden conversation, but twisted now into something far more scandalous through repetition and exaggeration. Eleanor first heard the full extent of it from the housekeeper, who came to her privately, her face troubled, to warn her that talk in the village had grown ugly enough that she thought Eleanor ought to know. "They are saying things that are not true," the housekeeper said gently. "About your character, miss, I thought you should be prepared, in case it reaches your family before you have a chance to explain yourself." Eleanor felt the floor shift slightly beneath her, though she kept her expression steady out of long habit. "Thank you for telling me. I will manage it." But managing it proved harder than she expected. Charlotte confronted her again that same evening, this time with tears in her eyes rather than anger, which somehow made the conversation more difficult to bear. "Do you understand what you have done?" Charlotte said, pacing the length of Eleanor's small room. "Beatrice says the whole county is talking. That you set out deliberately to steal his attention, that you have been meeting him secretly, that you care nothing for what happens to this family, as long as you get what you want. None of that is true, Charlotte, and you know it is not." "I do not know what I know anymore," Charlotte said, and the raw honesty of it startled Eleanor more than any accusation could have. "I have spent my whole life being told I am the pretty one, the one who will save this family through a good marriage, and now everyone is saying the Duke prefers you instead, and I do not know who I am if that is not true. I do not know what I am for." Eleanor crossed the room and took her sister's hands, feeling for the first time in a long while that they were simply two frightened young women rather than rivals in some contest neither of them had asked to enter. "You are more than a good marriage, Charlotte. You have always been more than that, even if Mama never let either of us believe it." Charlotte pulled her hands away gently, wiping at her eyes. "That is easy for you to say. You have never had to carry the whole weight of this family's hope on your face before." She left without another word, and Eleanor sat alone afterward, the accusation lingering uncomfortably close to a truth she had not fully considered before. 2 days later, her father summoned her again, his condition visibly worse. His breathing labored even while resting. He gestured weakly toward a chair beside his bed, and Eleanor sat, dread already settling in her stomach at the seriousness of his expression. "I have thought further on this matter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The rumors, the debt, your mother's schemes, all of it. I am asking something difficult of you now, Eleanor, and I want you to know I would not ask it if I saw any other way forward." He paused, gathering strength for what came next. "I am asking you to step back from the Duke entirely. Refuse his attention if he offers it again. Let your sister have her chance uncontested, and let this family's hopes rest where your mother has always intended them to rest." Eleanor's chest tightened painfully. "Papa, that is not fair to ask of me." "I know it is not," he said, his eyes glistening with something between apology and desperation. "But I am dying, Eleanor, whether any of us wish to say the word aloud or not, and I cannot leave this world knowing my family will collapse into ruin, because I could not manage my own affairs while I had the chance. Charlotte needs this match. This family needs this match. I am asking you to give her the space to secure it, for all our sakes, even if it costs you something you have not yet let yourself admit you want." Eleanor sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest like something physical. She thought of the fountain, of the garden, of the warmth in the Duke's eyes through the study window, and then she thought of her father's labored breathing, of Charlotte's tearful confusion, of the debt collector's letter still folded in her desk drawer. "I will do what is needed, Papa," she said finally, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "I promise you that." Her father squeezed her hand weakly, relief softening his tired features, and Eleanor left his room feeling as though she had just agreed to set fire to something she had only just begun to realize she wanted to keep. Smoke woke Eleanor before any sound did, a sharp, bitter smell curling under her door in the middle of the night, and she was on her feet and pulling on her robe before her mind had fully caught up with what her body already understood. She opened her door to find the hallway hazy, the smell far stronger now, and a distant orange glow flickering from somewhere near the back of the house, close to the kitchens and the old drying room where linens and stored grain were kept through the winter. She did not scream, though her heart pounded hard enough to hurt. Screaming would waste time. Instead, she moved quickly down the hallway, banging on doors as she went, calling out to wake the household, first her parents' room, then Charlotte's, then the servants' quarters at the far end of the house. Within minutes, chaos had taken over the halls of Whitmore House, servants rushing past in nightclothes, Mrs. Whitmore's voice rising in panic, Charlotte standing frozen in her doorway, unable to decide which direction to move. "Get Papa outside," Eleanor said sharply to Charlotte, taking control in a way she never had before in her sister's presence. "Now, Charlotte, he cannot manage the stairs quickly on his own, and every minute matters." Charlotte, startled by the firmness in her sister's voice, moved at last, hurrying to help their father from his bed, while Eleanor turned her attention to the servants gathering uncertainly in the hallway, unsure of what to do first. "The well behind the kitchen garden," Eleanor said, raising her voice to be heard over the growing commotion. "Buckets, all of you. Form a line from the well to the drying room. If the fire spreads to the main house, we lose everything. But if we can keep it contained to the drying room, we may save the rest." She turned to the young footman nearest her. "Ride for the Ashford estate. It is the nearest with enough men and equipment to help before this spreads further. Go now. Do not wait for permission. The footman hesitated only a moment before obeying, and Eleanor found herself directing the remaining household staff with a calm authority that surprised even her, drawing on the years of quiet management she had done with household ledgers and accounts, applying that same steady logic now to a crisis far more immediate and far more dangerous than any unpaid bill. She organized the bucket line herself, working alongside the servants rather than simply commanding them. Her nightgown soon soaked through with well water and streaked with soot, her hands blistering from the rough rope of the well bucket. But she did not stop, because stopping meant losing the only home her family had left. Her mother, meanwhile, wandered the front lawn in a state of near collapse, wringing her hands and calling out instructions that contradicted each other, more hindrance than help in the crisis, while Charlotte guided their father to a safe distance and then, once he was settled, ran back toward the house to find Eleanor, determined not to leave her sister to face the danger alone. "What can I do?" Charlotte said, arriving breathless at Eleanor's side. "Take this end of the line," Eleanor said, passing her a bucket without hesitation. "Pass it steady, do not rush it, or you will spill more than you carry." Charlotte, who had never in her life done a single hour of physical labor, took the bucket and did exactly as she was told, her fine nightgown ruined within minutes, her carefully curled hair coming loose and sticking to her sweat-damp face. But she did not complain, working alongside her sister with a determination that surprised them both. The fire fought hard against their efforts, flames licking higher along the wooden beams of the drying room, smoke thick enough now to sting every eye and throat in the yard. But the bucket line held, slow and steady, water meeting flame again and again, in a battle that felt endless in the moment, though it likely lasted less than half an hour before help arrived. The Duke arrived at the head of a small group of men from his own estate, having ridden hard the moment the footman's message reached him, and he was off his horse and directing his men into the effort before he had even fully taken in the scene before him. He found Eleanor at the well, her arms shaking with exhaustion, her face streaked with soot and sweat, still passing buckets with a steady rhythm despite her clear fatigue. "Miss Whitmore," he said, arriving at her side, his own composure remarkably steady given the chaos around them. "Tell me what has been done already, so we do not waste effort duplicating it." Eleanor, too exhausted and too focused on the immediate danger to feel any embarrassment at her appearance, gave him a quick, clear account of the situation, the location of the fire, the efforts already underway, the areas most at risk if the flames spread further. He listened carefully, nodding, and immediately began redirecting his men to reinforce the weakest points in her plan, working alongside her, rather than simply taking over, treating her assessment of the situation with the same seriousness he would give a trusted advisor. Together, over the following hour, they managed to contain the fire to the drying room alone, saving the main house and the majority of the family's remaining possessions, though the stored grain and linens within the drying room itself were a total loss. By the time the last embers were smothered and the danger had truly passed, dawn was beginning to break over the eastern fields, painting the smoke-hazed sky in soft shades of gray and gold. Eleanor sank down onto an overturned bucket near the well, her whole body trembling now that the urgency had passed, the adrenaline that had carried her through the crisis draining away and leaving exhaustion in its place. The Duke crouched beside her, offering a cup of water that one of his men had fetched, his expression full of a concern he did not bother trying to hide. "You saved this house tonight," he said quietly, "your quick thinking, your organization of the household. Without it, I believe the fire would have spread to the main structure before any help could arrive." "I only did what needed doing," Eleanor said, though her voice was hoarse from smoke and exertion. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," he said, with a firmness that made her look up at him properly. "Not anyone. I have watched a great many people in crisis over the past several months since inheriting my title, tenant disputes, financial difficulties on the estate, a barn fire not unlike this one only weeks after I took up my responsibilities. Most people freeze, or panic, or wait for someone else to tell them what to do. You did neither. You saw what needed to happen and you made it happen, calmly and clearly, while people twice your age stood by in confusion." He paused, studying her soot-streaked face with an expression that held none of the polite distance he maintained in her mother's parlor. "I find myself more certain than ever, Miss Whitmore, that I have been speaking to the wrong sort of person for most of this season. In every parlor and ballroom I have attended." Eleanor felt her exhaustion momentarily forgotten under the weight of his words, her heart beating with something that was not entirely fear, and not entirely exhaustion either. She thought suddenly of her promise to her father, made only days before, to step back and let Charlotte have her uncontested chance, and the memory sat uncomfortably alongside the warmth spreading through her chest at the Duke's words. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I made a promise to my father recently. To step aside from any attention you might show me, so that my sister might have a fair chance without my presence complicating matters. I intend to keep that promise." Something shifted in his expression, disappointment mixed with a kind of stubborn resolve. "I understand loyalty to family, Miss Whitmore. I respect it deeply, but I would ask you to consider whether a promise made out of fear and financial desperation is truly one that should bind either of us forever." He stood, offering his hand to help her rise from the overturned bucket. "I will not press the matter further tonight. You have been through enough already. But I do not intend to simply disappear because a promise was made in difficult circumstances." He left shortly after, once his men had finished ensuring no embers remained to reignite, and Eleanor watched his carriage disappear down the drive, with a complicated tangle of emotions she did not have the energy to fully untangle that morning. Her father, informed later that day of everything that had happened, of Eleanor's quick action in organizing the household and saving the main house from the fire, wept openly, his weakened health making his emotions harder to control than they once had been. "I have been a fool," he said, holding Eleanor's blistered hand gently in his own, "asking you to step back, to hide the very qualities that make you remarkable, simply because I was afraid of losing everything. I see now that I was wrong to ask it of you." "You were afraid, Papa. I understand why. Fear is no excuse for asking my daughter to make herself smaller than she is," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I release you from that promise, Eleanor. Whatever happens now, with the Duke, with Charlotte, with any of it, I want you to stop hiding what you are capable of. This family owes you that much, at the very least." Charlotte, present for this conversation, said nothing at first, though her expression carried none of the earlier resentment or fear that had colored their conversations over the previous weeks. When their father finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, she followed Eleanor out into the hallway and stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "I watched you last night," Charlotte said quietly, "directing everyone, keeping your head while the rest of us fell apart. I have never seen that side of you before, not really, not the way I saw it last night." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I think I have spent so long being told I am the one who matters in this family's future that I never stopped to consider what you might have been capable of, if anyone had ever bothered to look." "You do not need to say any of this, Charlotte." "I think I do," Charlotte said, "because I am beginning to understand something I did not want to understand before. If the Duke prefers you, it will not be because you stole anything from me. It will be because he saw something worth choosing, something I do not think I ever truly had to offer him beyond a pretty face at a ball." She managed a small, sad smile. "I am not saying this to be generous, Eleanor. I am saying it because I finally understand it is simply true." Eleanor embraced her sister then, the first genuine embrace they had shared in weeks, both of them still smelling faintly of smoke and exhaustion, and for the first time since the letter announcing the Duke's intended visit had first arrived, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine a future where she did not have to choose between her family's well-being and her own quiet, stubborn hope. That hope, however, would soon be tested more severely than either sister could have anticipated. The invitation to Lady Sinclair's grand London gathering arrived a week later, embossed and formal, addressed to the entire Whitmore family, and Mrs. Whitmore treated its arrival as though the Queen herself had summoned them. It was, everyone understood, to be the largest social event of the season so far, drawing families from across the county and beyond, and word had already spread that the Duke of Ashford was expected to attend. Eleanor felt a knot of unease settle in her stomach the moment she read the invitation, though she could not fully explain why, beyond a general sense that Lady Beatrice Sinclair rarely did anything without some deeper purpose behind it. The journey to London took the better part of 2 days, her father remaining behind under the housekeeper's careful watch since his health could not withstand the travel, though he insisted the rest of the family attend without him, unwilling to let his illness cost them this opportunity. Eleanor spent much of the carriage ride watching the countryside give way slowly to town and then city, her mind circling the same worry it had circled for days, a vague but persistent feeling that something unpleasant awaited them at the end of this journey. The Sinclair townhouse, when they arrived, was even grander than Eleanor had imagined, every room ablaze with candlelight, musicians playing in the ballroom, servants moving through the crowd with trays of refreshment balanced expertly above the press of bodies. Charlotte, dressed in her finest gown, drew admiring glances the moment they entered, and for a while the evening proceeded much as any other grand gathering did, conversation and dancing and the careful performance of society at its most polished. The Duke arrived roughly an hour into the evening, and Eleanor felt her pulse quicken despite herself when she caught sight of him across the crowded ballroom, dressed formally, his expression composed but his eyes searching the room in a way that suggested he was looking for someone specific. When his gaze finally found hers, something in his posture eased slightly, and he began making his way toward her through the crowd, though he was intercepted repeatedly along the way by acquaintances eager for his attention. Lady Beatrice found Eleanor first, appearing at her side with a smile that did not reach her eyes, her fingers curling lightly but firmly around Eleanor's arm. "Come, dear Eleanor, let me introduce you properly to some of my London friends. They have heard so much about you already." Eleanor allowed herself to be led, uneasy but unwilling to cause a scene by refusing, toward a small cluster of fashionable young women gathered near the refreshment table, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile as Beatrice made the introductions. "This is Eleanor Whitmore," Beatrice announced, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the surrounding guests. "The young lady who has been so cleverly maneuvering herself into the Duke of Ashford's attention, despite having so little to offer him beyond her sister's shadow to hide within." A ripple of laughter moved through the small crowd, and Eleanor felt her face flush, though she kept her chin lifted, refusing to give Beatrice the satisfaction of visible distress. "I am not certain what you mean, Lady Beatrice." "Oh, do not be modest now. Of all moments," Beatrice continued, her voice growing sharper, more performative, clearly intended for the wider audience that had begun to gather at the edges of the conversation, drawn by the promise of scandal. "We have all heard the story, how you crept away from your own sister's courtship at every opportunity, to steal private moments with a man who deserves far better than a woman who cannot even bring herself a proper dowry, let alone the manners suited to a duchess. Tell me, did you plan the fire at your own estate as well, simply to have an excuse to throw yourself into his arms in front of witnesses?" The accusation landed like a physical blow, and Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as gasps and murmurs spread quickly through the growing crowd around them. It was, of course, an absurd and cruel suggestion, but she understood immediately the danger of it, how quickly such a rumor could spread and calcify into accepted truth if left unanswered, how devastating it would be for her family's reputation, already fragile enough given their financial difficulties. "That is a vicious and baseless accusation," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to remain composed. "And you know it to be false, Lady Beatrice." "Do I?" Beatrice's smile widened, sensing blood in the water. "Or do I simply know what any reasonable person would conclude, watching a penniless younger daughter position herself so carefully in a wealthy duke's path, again and again, while her own sister, the one everyone always expected to make the match, is left humiliated and overlooked?" More guests had gathered now, drawn by the raised voices and the promise of a genuine scandal unfolding in real time, and Eleanor felt suddenly, horribly exposed, the center of attention in a way she had never once wanted to be, surrounded by faces she did not know, whispering judgments she could not defend herself against fast enough. Charlotte, hearing the commotion from across the room, pushed her way through the crowd, her own face pale with alarm. "That is enough, Beatrice," Charlotte said, arriving at Eleanor's side and taking her hand firmly. "You know as well as I do that none of what you are saying is true." "Do I, Charlotte?" Beatrice turned her sharp attention now toward Charlotte instead, her expression shifting into something almost pitying. "Or are you simply too loyal, or too humiliated, to admit what the whole county has already whispered about for weeks, your own sister stealing your chance at happiness, right beneath your nose, while you smiled and pretended not to notice?" "My sister has done nothing but support this family through every difficulty we have faced," Charlotte said, her voice growing stronger, more certain, than Eleanor had ever heard it in a confrontation before. "She organized the entire household during a fire that could have destroyed our home, while the rest of us stood by in confusion. She has managed our family's accounts for years without a single word of thanks, while I received all the praise simply for having a pleasant face. If the Duke has come to admire her, it is because she has earned that admiration through her own character, not through any scheme or deception." The crowd murmured at this, uncertain now which version of events to believe, and Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude toward her sister so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes, though she fought to keep her composure in front of so many watching faces. It was at this moment that the Duke arrived, having finally pushed his way through the crowd toward the commotion, his expression darkening as he took in the scene before him, Eleanor pale and shaken, Beatrice smug and triumphant, the surrounding guests whispering behind raised fans and gloved hands. "What is the meaning of this?" he said, his voice carrying an authority that immediately silenced the surrounding chatter. Beatrice recovered quickly, her expression shifting into something more demure, more calculated for his benefit specifically. Your Grace, I was merely expressing some concern, shared by many here tonight, regarding Miss Eleanor Whitmore's conduct these past weeks. Surely you have heard the same whispers I have. I have heard many whispers this season, Lady Beatrice, the Duke said, his eyes moving from her to Eleanor, taking in her distress with an expression that softened considerably when directed toward her. Most of them tedious, some of them cruel, and very few of them accurate. I believe I am owed the chance to correct this particular rumor myself, given that it concerns my own conduct as much as Miss Whitmore's. The crowd had gone entirely silent now, every eye in the vicinity fixed on the unfolding scene, and Eleanor felt her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone nearby could hear it. I did not seek out Miss Whitmore's company through any scheme of hers, the Duke continued, his voice clear and steady enough to carry across the hushed ballroom. I sought her out because, from our very first conversation, before either of us knew who the other truly was, I found in her an honesty and a clarity of character that I have found in almost no one else this season, myself included, when I have been too often guilty of performing politeness rather than speaking my true mind. I have watched her manage her family's affairs with a competence many men twice her age could not match. I watched her direct an entire household through a dangerous fire with a calm authority that saved her family's home. And I have watched her, tonight, endure a cruel and baseless attack on her character with more grace than most people in this room could manage under far kinder circumstances. He turned fully toward Eleanor now, ignoring the murmuring crowd entirely, his expression open in a way she had never seen him allow in public before. Miss Whitmore, I understand you made a promise to your father some weeks ago, to step back from any attention I might offer, for your family's sake. I have respected that promise, though it has cost me considerable patience to do so. I am asking you now, in front of every witness in this room, whether that promise still stands, or whether you might allow me the chance to properly court you, without secrecy, without apology, and without regard for what any of these whispered rumors might suggest. The ballroom had gone entirely silent, every guest holding their breath for her answer, and Eleanor felt the weight of every eye upon her, the very exposure she had feared only minutes before, now transformed into something else entirely, a chance rather than a threat. My father released me from that promise, she said, her voice steadier than she expected, carrying clearly across the hushed room. He told me it was wrong of him to ask me to hide what I am capable of, simply out of fear. I would welcome your courtship, Your Grace, openly and without apology, if you are certain it is truly what you want, and not simply a reaction to tonight's unpleasantness. I have been certain of it for weeks, he said, and something in his expression, relief mixed with a warmth he no longer bothered to hide, made the surrounding crowd break into a wave of astonished murmurs, some scandalized, many quietly delighted by the drama of it all. Lady Beatrice, her triumphant expression collapsed entirely into something closer to panic, attempted a final defense. Your Grace, surely you cannot mean to publicly humiliate her own sister in this manner, choosing one over the other in front of the entire county. I am not choosing between sisters, Lady Beatrice, the Duke said, his tone growing cold for the first time that evening. I am correcting a cruel rumor you yourself set in motion tonight, out of what I can only assume is jealousy or malice, neither of which reflects well on your own character. I would suggest in the future that you find better uses for your considerable social influence than attacking the reputation of a woman who has done nothing but endure your cruelty with more patience than she owed you. Beatrice, thoroughly humiliated in front of the very crowd she had gathered to witness Eleanor's downfall, excused herself quickly, disappearing into the wider party with her composure in visible tatters, while the surrounding guests began to disperse slowly, whispering now not about Eleanor's supposed scheming, but about the remarkable scene they had just witnessed. A duke publicly declaring his intentions in defense of a woman's society had spent weeks trying to diminish. Mrs. Whitmore arrived moments later, having heard second-hand reports of the commotion, her face a complicated mixture of shock, relief, and rapid recalculation of the family's prospects. Your Grace, she said, curtsying deeply, I do apologize for any confusion this evening. I am certain we can discuss the matter properly, at a more suitable time. There is no confusion to discuss, Mrs. Whitmore, the Duke said, though his tone toward her carried none of the warmth he had shown Eleanor. I intend to court your daughter Eleanor openly, with your family's blessing if you are willing to give it honestly, and without further interference if you are not. Mrs. Whitmore's mouth opened and closed once before she managed a response, clearly still adjusting to a reality so different from the one she had spent months carefully constructing. Of course, Your Grace. Whatever makes Eleanor happy, whatever makes this family, whatever serves everyone's best interests. Charlotte, standing quietly beside Eleanor throughout this exchange, squeezed her sister's hand gently and offered a small, genuine smile, free now of the resentment or fear that had colored so many of their recent conversations. It seems, she whispered, that the county will have quite a lot to discuss for weeks to come. I am sorry, Charlotte, Eleanor whispered back, for all of it. This was never what I wanted, to take something from you. You did not take anything from me, Charlotte said quietly. I am only sorry it took me so long to see what was in front of me the whole time. She squeezed Eleanor's hand once more before stepping back, allowing her sister the space to stand at the center of a moment that, for once in either of their lives, truly belonged to Eleanor alone. Word of what had happened at Lady Sinclair's gathering reached the county well before the Whitmore family's carriage did, and by the time Eleanor arrived home, the whole village seemed already to know some version of the story, though the details had shifted and multiplied with each retelling, as gossip always did. She found, to her surprise, that the attention now felt different than it had before. Where once she had been dismissed or overlooked, now she was watched with open curiosity, and where once whispers had questioned her character, now they questioned instead how they had all failed to notice her worth sooner. Her father, informed of everything upon her return, wept again, though this time the tears carried none of the guilt or fear of their earlier conversation, only a pure, unguarded pride that Eleanor had never seen quite so openly on his face before. I always knew you were remarkable, he said, holding her hands in both of his. I am only ashamed it took a duke's public declaration for the rest of the world to see it as clearly as I have. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of visits from the Duke, no longer disguised as attention toward Charlotte, no longer requiring secrecy or careful timing to avoid gossip, since the gossip itself had already run its course and settled into acceptance. He came often, sometimes formally, announced and expected, and sometimes simply appearing in the garden while Eleanor tended her herbs, falling easily into the kind of comfortable conversation that had first drawn them together at the fountain months before. I have been thinking, he said, during one such garden visit, watching her carefully prune a row of rosemary, about how differently this season might have unfolded had I not wandered out to that fountain the night we first met. I might have spent the entire season speaking politely with women who told me exactly what they thought I wished to hear, and returned to my estate at the end of it no better acquainted with myself than when I arrived. You give the fountain too much credit, Eleanor said, smiling despite herself. I nearly did not walk that way at all. I only wanted air, and quiet, away from the noise of the ballroom. Then I am grateful for your need of quiet, he said, since it gave me the one honest conversation I had all season. He set down the small trowel he had been idly turning over in his hands, his expression growing more serious. Eleanor, I did not come today merely to admire your garden, though I do admire it. I came because I find myself unable to imagine returning to my estate at the end of each visit without wondering when I might see you again, and I have decided I no longer wish to wonder. He knelt then, right there among the rosemary and lavender, and Eleanor felt her breath catch entirely, her hands going still around the herbs she had been holding. I know that a proposal delivered in a garden, without the grandeur society might expect for a duke's engagement, may seem an odd choice. But it was in a garden that I first learned your honesty, and it seemed fitting that I should ask you here as well, without performance, without an audience, simply as myself asking you to be my wife. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she had not expected, and for a moment she could not find any words at all, only nodding, before finally managing to speak. Yes, I will marry you. He rose and took her hands in his, and the kiss that followed was gentle and unhurried, the culmination of months of careful, honest conversation rather than any sudden passion, though the warmth of it left Eleanor's heart racing regardless. When they finally parted, both of them slightly breathless, he laughed softly, an unguarded sound she had rarely heard from him. I should ask your father's blessing properly, he said, though I suspect, given recent events, he will not be terribly surprised by the request. Lord Whitmore was not surprised, and gave his blessing with tears in his eyes once again, though these tears, like the ones before, carried nothing but genuine happiness. Mrs. Whitmore, for her part, adjusted quickly to the new arrangement, her earlier disappointment over Charlotte's lost opportunity, giving way rapidly to enthusiastic planning for what would undoubtedly be the grandest wedding the county had seen in a generation. A shift so swift and complete that Eleanor found herself more amused than offended by it. Charlotte, when told the news, embraced her sister warmly, without a trace of the earlier bitterness that had once colored their conversations. I am happy for you, she said, and Eleanor could hear the truth of it in her voice. Truly happy, Eleanor. I have had some time now to think about what I actually want, rather than what Mama always told me I should want, and I find I am not so certain marriage to a duke was ever truly my own dream to begin with. Perhaps this outcome suits us both better than either of us realized. The wedding, when it finally arrived some months later, was every bit as grand as Mrs. Whitmore had hoped, held at the Ashford Estate's own chapel, attended by nearly the entire county along with a good portion of London society, curious to witness in person the conclusion of a courtship that had provided the season's most talked-about scandal and, ultimately, its most talked-about romance. Eleanor wore a gown far finer than anything she had ever imagined owning, though what she remembered most clearly from that day was not the gown or the guests or the grandeur of the chapel, but simply the Duke's face as she walked toward him, open and unguarded and full of a happiness that matched her own. Lord Whitmore, his health still fragile but stable enough to attend, walked her down the aisle himself, his pride evident in every careful step, and whispered to her quietly just before giving her hand to the Duke's. You saved this family in more ways than one, Eleanor. Never forget that it was your own quiet strength that did it, not luck, and not chance. The family's debts, it turned out, were resolved quietly and without fanfare shortly before the wedding, the Duke settling the matter directly with the creditor without ever mentioning it to Eleanor beforehand, not out of any wish to control her family's finances, but simply because he understood, without being told, how much the weight of that debt had cost her over the years, and wished to lift it from her shoulders as a quiet gift rather than a grand gesture. When Eleanor discovered what he had done, weeks after their wedding, she found him in his study reviewing estate accounts, and she crossed the room to embrace him without a word of explanation needed between them. You did not have to do that, she said, though her voice carried no complaint in it, only gratitude. I know, he said, setting aside his papers to hold her properly. I wanted to. You spent years carrying that weight alone, managing numbers no one else in your family thought to notice or thank you for. I only wished, in some small way, to give some of that weight back to you as relief, instead of burden. Charlotte, in the months following the wedding, found her own path forward, one that surprised everyone in the family, including herself. She had grown close, during the wedding preparations, to a quiet young clergyman who had come to assist with the chapel arrangements, a man entirely unlike the wealthy suitors their mother had always pushed toward her, but whose gentle steadiness seemed to suit Charlotte's newly discovered sense of self far better than any grand title ever could have. Their courtship, unhurried and unremarked upon by county gossip, blossomed quietly over the following year, and Charlotte's own eventual wedding, though far smaller and simpler than her sister's, brought her a happiness that seemed, to everyone who witnessed it, entirely genuine and entirely her own. Eleanor settled into her new life as Duchess of Ashford with the same steady competence she had once brought to her family's modest household accounts, now applied to the far larger responsibilities of managing a great estate, though she never lost the habit of tending her own small garden, insisting on maintaining it herself despite having servants enough to do the work for her. Her husband often found her there in quiet moments, sleeves rolled up, hands in the soil, and he had long since stopped trying to convince her to leave such work entirely to others, understanding by now that the garden gave her a peace she needed and valued, more than any title or grandeur their marriage had brought her. Their life together was not without its ordinary difficulties, disagreements over estate matters, adjustments to the different rhythms of their upbringing, the occasional lingering awkwardness when old acquaintances from that scandalous season attempted to reference the gossip that had once surrounded their courtship. But through all of it, the foundation they had built in that first honest conversation by the fountain held steady, a partnership built on plain speech and genuine respect rather than performance or convenience, exactly the kind of marriage Eleanor had never once believed herself likely to have, given how thoroughly the world around her had once taught her to expect nothing. On the first anniversary of their wedding, the Duke found Eleanor in the garden once more, this time simply sitting quietly among the roses rather than working, watching the sunset spread gold and pink across the estate grounds. He sat beside her without a word, taking her hand in his the way he had 100 times before, and for a long while neither of them spoke at all, content simply to sit together in the comfortable quiet that had first drawn them to each other, so long ago, in a different garden, at a different fountain, when neither of them had known who the other truly was, only that something honest and worth keeping had passed between them in the dark. Everyone expected me to choose your sister, he said eventually, breaking the silence with a small, knowing smile. The beautiful one, the celebrated one, the one everyone had already decided, deserved the title before I ever arrived at that first ball. And yet you chose the one no one noticed, Eleanor said, leaning her head against his shoulder. I chose the one worth noticing, he corrected gently, which, I have come to learn, is not always the same thing at all. They sat together as the last light faded from the sky, two people who had found each other not through the performance society expected, but through honesty offered freely in a quiet garden, and Eleanor thought, as she often did in such peaceful moments, that she would not trade this quiet, hard-won happiness for anything the world might have offered her instead, not the beauty everyone had praised in her sister, not the ease of a life unburdened by responsibility, nothing at all beyond exactly what she had, sitting here, in the fading light, beside the one person who had ever truly seen her. 2 years into her marriage, Eleanor received a letter that made her set down her morning tea and read the page 3 times before she trusted herself to understand it correctly. It came from a solicitor in London, representing a distant cousin of her father's whom she had never met, a man who had died without heirs and left behind a small property in the north, along with a modest sum of money, willed unexpectedly to Eleanor herself, the letter explained, because the old man had once heard a story of a young woman who saved her family's estate from fire with her own 2 hands, and had admired the tale enough to remember her name years later. She brought the letter to her husband that evening, still faintly astonished by the strange turn of fortune, and he laughed warmly when she finished reading it aloud. It seems your reputation continues to grow in directions neither of us could have predicted, he said. First a duke's attention, now the inheritance of a stranger who admired your courage from a distance. I begin to wonder what other surprises your quiet competence might yet bring us. Eleanor decided, after some thought, to use the small inheritance not for herself but to establish a modest fund for tenant families on the Ashford estate, who found themselves, as her own family once had, caught in the gap between hardship and ruin, unable to manage sudden debts or repairs without falling into deeper trouble. She oversaw the fund personally, reviewing requests and accounts with the same careful attention she had once given her father's ledgers, and within the first year alone, 3 tenant families avoided losing their homes entirely because of assistance that asks nothing in return beyond honest repayment when circumstances allowed. Her husband watched this work with quiet pride, often joining her in the small estate office she had claimed for herself, a room previously used for storage that she had transformed into a proper workspace, complete with her own desk and her own ledgers, a space entirely her own within a household that had once seemed almost too grand to belong to someone who had grown up counting coins in a tin box. You have built something remarkable here, he told her one evening, watching her balance the fund's accounts by candlelight. Not merely a marriage, though I hope that too, but a purpose entirely your own, separate from anything either of our families expected of you. I could not have built it without the freedom your name and your trust in me provided, Eleanor said, though she accepted the compliment with a small, pleased smile. But I think you are right that it feels like mine, in a way few things in my life ever have before. Charlotte visited often during these years, her own quiet marriage to the clergyman having settled into a contentment entirely different from the grand ambitions their mother had once held for her, but no less genuine for its modesty. She brought her young daughter along on these visits, a bright, curious child who adored her Aunt Eleanor above nearly everyone else in her small world, following her around the garden asking endless questions about the herbs and flowers, questions Eleanor answered with the same patient honesty she gave to everyone in her life. She reminds me of you at that age, Charlotte said one afternoon, watching her daughter kneel in the dirt beside Eleanor, carefully helping to weed a row of lavender. Always more interested in understanding how things worked than in being noticed for anything at all. I hope she grows up in a world that notices her anyway, Eleanor said, watching the child with real fondness, without her having to fight so hard for it as I once did. With you as her aunt, I do not think that will be a problem, Charlotte said. You have shown this whole county, whether they wish to learn the lesson or not, that quiet worth deserves just as much recognition as loud beauty ever did. Lord Whitmore lived 3 more years beyond the wedding, longer than the physician had once predicted, a fact everyone in the family quietly attributed to the relief of watching his daughters both settle into genuine happiness, along with the lifting of the financial burden that had weighed on him for so long. He spent much of those final years at the Ashford estate, welcomed warmly by his son-in-law, spending long afternoons in Eleanor's garden discussing crops and accounts and, increasingly, simply enjoying the company of his grandchildren as first Charlotte and then Eleanor herself began raising families of her own. When he finally passed, peacefully, in his sleep, with both his daughters at his bedside, his last clear words were directed to Eleanor, gripping her hand with what strength remained to him. You were always the strongest of us, he said. even when the world could not see it. I am only grateful I lived long enough to watch everyone else finally catch up to what I always knew. Eleanor grieved him deeply, though the grief was softened by the knowledge that his final years had been genuinely happy ones, free from the debt and worry that had once consumed nearly every conversation in their household. She named her second child after him, a small son with her father's same thoughtful eyes, and she often told him stories, as he grew, of the grandfather he had been too young to remember properly, stories of quiet strength and honest counting, and a household saved not through beauty or luck, but through careful attention and steady courage. The Duke, for his part, grew into his role as a father with the same steady seriousness he brought to everything else, though Eleanor delighted in watching the softer, more playful side of him that only their children seemed able to draw out fully. Tea parties held solemnly on the nursery floor, long afternoons spent teaching their eldest daughter to ride her first pony with a patience that surprised even Eleanor, who had long since learned there was very little about her husband's character left to surprise her. Lady Beatrice Sinclair, whose scheming had once threatened to destroy Eleanor's reputation entirely, faded gradually from relevance within London society over those same years, her sharp tongue and calculated cruelty eventually earning her more enemies than allies among a social circle that valued usefulness above spite. Eleanor heard occasional news of her, second-hand and distant, a broken engagement here, a diminished invitation list there, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt no satisfaction in the woman's decline, only a distant sort of pity for someone who had never learned to build genuine worth the way Eleanor herself eventually had. On a quiet evening many years after that first fateful ball, Eleanor stood once more beside the fountain in her old family garden, now visiting with her own children in tow, showing them the exact spot where she had once had an honest conversation with a stranger who turned out to change the entire course of her life. Her husband stood beside her, older now, gray beginning to touch his temples, though his eyes held the same steady warmth they always had when they settled on her. "Do you remember what you told me, that first night?" he asked. "About being invisible? About no one wanting anything from you?" "I remember," Eleanor said, smiling at the memory of her younger self, so certain then that her quiet competence would never be enough to matter to anyone beyond her own family's ledgers. "I am glad, every single day, that I chose to walk out into that garden instead of remaining in that crowded ballroom," he said. "Every single day since, Eleanor, I have been grateful that the world's usual expectations proved so entirely wrong." She took his hand, watching their children chase each other laughing around the old stone fountain, the same fountain where a duke and an overlooked younger sister had once found, quite by accident, the beginning of a life neither of them had ever expected to have, built not on beauty or performance, but on honesty offered freely in the dark, and on the simple, powerful truth that quiet worth, given enough patience and enough courage, will always eventually be seen.